So we're going to be talking about main causes of the Civil War, things that led up to the Civil War, kind of just like little tidbits and facts. So basic background information, the war lasted from 1861 to 65. It was the North versus the South, the North being Union, South being Confederate. North was industrial in their economy, and South was very agricultural, which led to slavery, and slavery was can be argued to be the main reason as to why the Civil War took place. So economic differences between the North and the South. The North was mostly based on industry, and between 1800 and 1860, percentage of laborers working in agricultural pursuits dropped from 70 to 40, and slavery had died out and been replaced by factories and all these new industries that were being created in immigrant labor from Europe. There was a lot of immigrants that came and didn't settle in the South but settled in the North. 7 out of every 8 settled in the North rather than the South. Transportation was mostly built off of railroads, which also increased their industrial businesses and workforce, as well as very good and fast transportation. The South, on the other hand, was just farm country. Very good soil and good climate, so there was a lot of farming. Their main output was cotton. There was no real transport except other than boat on small rivers and things like that, so there was no real transport. It was very hard to get around in the South. They depended on North trade for industrial goods, so the North and the South traded a lot, but it was mostly goods from the North coming to the South because the South only really was agricultural and just kind of farmed for most of it. And they needed slavery for the farm work, so that's why they were for slavery. They were pro-slavery, and the North was against slavery, no slavery. Sad face. Political issues, slavery being one of the main ones, but we're going to talk about other ones as well. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 created the 3630 parallel line and the state of Missouri, and underneath the south, to the south and the southeast of the 3630 parallel line, slavery was allowed and it was welcome, and everything above the parallel line, slavery was illegal, it was banned. The Compromise of 1850 created the state of California and declared it as a free state. Stronger fugitive slave laws were created in the South for slaves that were escaping to the West, and the D.C. area was declared no slave trade area. So now you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, and it kind of overthrew the Missouri Compromise by saying that male settlers were allowed to decide through popular sovereignty which territory would have slaves. So the people who were living in Kansas and Nebraska, these new states that were created, they were allowed to decide if those were free states or slave states, not the government. And Lincoln versus Douglas, those were the two main competitors in the 1860 presidential election. Lincoln, being a Democrat and a member of the Whig Party, proclaimed that compromises would no longer suffice because no middle ground existed. Douglas, on the other hand, being a Republican, he's said that by supporting the will of the people, he alone best exemplified republicanism, and he best represented the people of the South because he was supporting what they wanted and the decisions they wanted to make. So on this slide we have a photo of the Compromise of 1850, and this is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So moving on now to states' rights, you have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty being a main part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was the people in that state got to decide if they wanted that state to be a free state or a slave state, not the government, just the people occupying that. In whatever small state government created, that is what decided. Then you have the 1832 nullification crisis. Nullification is the formal suspension by a state of a federal law within its borders. So a state could decide if a law was unconstitutional or not, and then they could declare that law unconstitutional just in their state alone. This led to the nullification crisis based in South Carolina. The Tariff of Abominations, or the Tariff of 1828, under the President Andrew Jackson, raised tariffs on manufactured goods like textiles and wool. It didn't really affect the North because the North was producing all these goods, but since the North traded with the South and the South was dependent on Northern trade and Northern goods, the South felt a lot of economic pain from having to stall their economy since they relied on northern goods and since they didn't have enough money to pay off all these tariffs. So there was a lot of feuds and there was a lot of attempts at nullifying that law that failed. And then Henry Clay, a gentleman, came up with a solution. The Compromise Tariff of 1833 stated that the high tariff would be lowered 10% over 8 years. So instead of a really high tariff, it would be decreased by 10% over an 8-year period. South Carolina was happy that they got a small victory, but still economically in turmoil a little bit. The North didn't really care. And then we have sectionalism. Sectionalism is the loyalty to a section of the country, not the country as a whole. So in this photo right here, we have the West as their own section, the North, and then the South as their own section. And that meant that the South, instead of being loyal to the entire United States, they were only loyal to the South and only cared about what the South wanted in the South economy and South political views and everything like that. So that made the North very separate. And in this sectionalism, this caused a lot of feuds, a lot of differences, and it kind of ultimately led to the nullification of the South nullifying themselves from the Union. So they separated and they seceded and created the Confederacy instead. So you have the South as their own section of the United States, sectionalism, based on things like Stephen Douglas's political views, saying that he exemplified republicanism, slavery, their economy, and things like that. So they became their own section and ultimately created the Confederacy. So now here's a quick